RMS Olympic was a British ocean liner and the lead ship of her class, the Olympic class. Serving as a passenger vessel as well as a troop ship during the First World War, her career would be marked by tragedy, but also reliability. She earned the nickname Old Reliable because Olympic, despite everything she went through during her life, always pushed through. She was tough, real tough, and everyone loved her. Originally built with a tonnage of 45,324, upgrades would see that raised to 46,358, and then further upgrades raised it again to 46,439. She displaced 52,067 tons, had a length of 882 feet 9 inches, a beam of 92 feet 9 inches, a height of 154 feet, a draft of 34 feet 7 inches, with 9 decks. 8 for passengers and 1 for her crew. She was powered by 24 double-ended and 5 single-ended Scotch boilers, originally built to burn coal, though later converted to oil. Her 2 4-cylinder triple expansion reciprocating engines produced 15,000 horsepower for the 2 outboard wing propellers, and a single low-pressure turbine produced 16,000 horsepower, reaching a total of 46,000 horsepower between all of it. Although she was capable of hitting 59,000 horsepower if she really had to. She had 3 different props, 2 bronze 3-braided wing propellers and 1 bronze 4-bladed center propeller, capable of pushing her to a normal speed of 21 knots. With upgrades she could hit as high as 23 knots, and as she really pushed herself, more on that later, she could hit 24.2 knots. She had a capacity for 2,435 passengers and 950 crew, and indeed for a few windows in time, she was the largest ocean liner in the world, and again, one of the most reliable. Olympic sailed through a cloud of sorrow and loss to become one of the most celebrated ocean liners in history, and many a person's favorite. There would be a total of 3 Olympic-class ocean liners constructed for the White Star Line. Olympic was the eldest, followed by her little sisters, Titanic and Britannic. White Star was in a bit of a difficult situation. Their major rival, Cunard, had recently launched the Lusitania and the Mauretania, which were the fastest passenger ships in service at the time. It gave Cunard some attractiveness to potential customers, so naturally White Star Line had to come up with some plan to try to compete with them. Their chairman, J. Bruce Ismay, decided not to go with the speed element. He thought that they should try to attract a crowd looking for size and cost effectiveness. He wanted the ships to be big, able to carry a lot of people, and by carrying a lot of people, they could make ticket prices cheaper. Yes, they might be a little bit slower than Cunard's offerings, but some people preferred to spend a little less, and maybe get there a little later, than paying extra for speed. There were 2 different markets to consider in that regard, which was clever. The creation of the Olympic class goes back to both Ismay as well as J.P. Morgan, who was in control of White Star Line's parent corporation, International Mercantile Marine Company. J.P. Morgan liked Ismay's idea, and they also pushed the concept that these ships would be the last word in comfort and luxury. Not only would they be more cost-effective, but also if you did want to pay extra, you would get an experience like no other available. Opulence and grandeur were the main goals, and the order would be placed for Olympic in 1907 with Harland & Wolff, located in Belfast. White Star had gone to Harland & Wolff for a lot of their ships. They had a relationship dating back to 1867, and Harland & Wolff was good. Really good at making ships. That was their whole job, and boy howdy, they were arguably the best at it. White Star Line trusted them so much that Harland & Wolff was getting a tremendous amount of freedom with the overall design of the ships. Basically, the conversation went like this. "Oh, hey there, lads. What can we do for you?" "We need big chungus." Is that it? "Yes." "Well, alright, we're on it." Additionally, White Star decided not to restrict Harland & Wolff when it came to expenses. Again, they trusted them, so they told them to spend whatever they needed to make the ships awesome. As the designs came together, A cost of £3 million for the first two ships was agreed on, plus extras to contract and a 5% profit margin for building them in the first place. The project was overseen by Lord Peary, who was the director of both Harland and Wolff and the White Star Line, as well as naval architect Thomas Andrews, who was the managing director of Harland and Wolff's design department. Also included in the task were Edward Wilding and Alexander Carlisle. On July 29, 1908, Harland and Wolff would come back with drawings and present them to Ismay and the rest of the White Star Line's executives. Ismay loved what they came up with, and White Star authorized construction to begin. Olympic wasn't given her name at this point, only her number, 400, which was simply because she was Harland and Wolff's 400th hull. The name Olympic actually came directly from Ismay's father, Thomas Henry Ismay, who had originally planned to build a ship called Olympic, which was supposed to be a sister to Oceanic. But that would never come to pass, as Bruce's father would die in 1899, and the order for the original Olympic would be cancelled. But now was a chance to utilize that name again, in a small way to honor his late father. Titanic was also ordered about this same time, given the number 401, and Olympic was first, but they were constructed at relatively the same time. Olympic was started 3 months prior to Titanic, and that was mostly because of the yard constraints. Frankly, it was hard enough building one gigantic ocean liner for Harland and Wolff. 2 at the same time was really pushing it, so Olympic was given a 3-month head start. Harland and Wolff, in fact, had to upgrade their entire facility in Belfast, even combining 3 different slipways into just 2 larger ones, because big chunkus. They were like, I don't even know how we're gonna launch this, so what if we just put these slipways together? You know, that's a great idea! Just do that! Why did we take this job? I believe it was money, sir. Of course! We need it! Do it! Both Olympic and Titanic were constructed right next to each other, with Olympic herself being laid down on December 16, 1908, and being launched October 20th, 1910. She wasn't christened at all, and that was a White Star thing. Those in the know that a lot of ships get christened whenever they get launched. It's just a tradition. Military ships, passenger ships, all sorts of ships. Someone throws a bottle of champagne, smashes it on the ship, and then you launch the ship. It's all fun and dandy. But White Star didn't like christening their ships, so Olympic went off without being christened. And as she came together, the luxury really came into the picture. First-class passengers on Olympic could enjoy luxurious cabins with private bathrooms, enjoy their meals on the large and luxurious dining saloon, or in the a la carte restaurant. There was the fancy schmancy grand staircase, built only for the Olympic-class ships, a Georgian-style smoke room, a veranda cafe decorated with palm trees, a whole swimming pool, Victorian Turkish baths, a gymnasium, and based on that description, it kind of sounds like a cruise ship more than an ocean liner, and she wasn't. She was designed to move passengers first, but White Star's push here was to make travel, well, also elegant and enjoyable and luxurious. They wanted people to have a wonderful experience while traveling, not just, shove them on the boat and get them across the ocean. No. We want you to have a good time here. If you were first class. Third class was more shove them on the boat and get them across the ocean. Third class was not nearly as nice, but that wasn't unusual for the time. And honestly, even third class wasn't that bad on Olympic. She had rather large dormitories for them, and they even had their own smoking room, a common area, and a dining room. So even in third class, you still had a pretty decent time, and the elegance of the Olympic class was amplified by their overall design. For many, the Olympics represent some of the nicest looking ocean liners ever built. They were beautiful. They avoided bulky exterior air vents entirely, using smaller ones that had electric fans, and they also had 4 funnels, but only 3 were, relevant. The 4th was a dummy, used for additional ventilation. Their size, elegance, as well as profile made the ships instantly recognizable, even from a distance. Though it is worth mentioning that Olympic and Titanic were not identical. Titanic had a higher gross tonnage, for example, and was considered slightly larger. And some of the internals were different too. Half of Titanic's A-deck promenade was enclosed by a steel screen with sliding windows. This was to provide additional shelter. Olympics remained open along the whole length, which was, beyond looking at their name, the easiest way to tell them apart. Another change had to do with the B-deck first-class promenade decks. Olympic had these, but they weren't really used. This is because, frankly, the A-deck promenade had so much room that most people just stayed there. There was no reason to use the B-deck at all. So Thomas Andrews eliminated that feature on Titanic entirely, and instead, Titanic's B-deck had additional enlarged staterooms with ensuite bathrooms. Though that did mean that second-class promenade space on B-deck was reduced aboard Titanic, but second class, whatever, I'm sure they won't mind. Titanic also had a reception area for the restaurant aft of her grand staircase, which just flat out wasn't there on Olympic, and the main reception room on D-deck was enlarged. When Olympic was refitted in 1913, a lot of these differences were actually, changed. Olympic was made to be a bit closer to her sister, though she did keep her open A-deck promenade. That would stay permanent for her entire career. Again, easiest way to tell them apart. When Olympic was completed, she started her sea trials on May 29th, 1911, where all her capabilities were tested, with the exception of a speed test. The trials went great though. She did really well. She was stable and performed exactly to specifications. Afterwards, she would leave Belfast bound for Liverpool on May 31st, 1911. And as a big publicity stunt, White Star opted to time Olympic's first voyage to coincide with the launch of her sister, Titanic. She was open to the public for a whole day while she was in Liverpool, and then she sailed to Southampton, arriving there on June 3rd to be prepared for her maiden voyage. Her crew was very excited, and newspapers talked up the glorious new Olympic-class liner. As part of developing this new family of massive passenger ships, a new dock was built, which was at the time called the White Star Dock. It was a deep water dock, and built specifically to accommodate Olympic and her sisters because they couldn't fit very easily anywhere else. That had opened up in 1911, and she sailed out on her maiden voyage on June 14th, 1911, from Southampton, calling at both Cherbourg and Queenstown. She arrived in New York City on June 21st, with 1,313 passengers aboard, under Captain Edward Smith. Her designer, Thomas Andrews, was also on board, staying with her for the whole journey to and from America. Bruce Ismay, along with Harland and Wolff's Guarantee Group, were also on board. This was because it was her maiden voyage, and they wanted to make sure she was performing properly. They were there to spot any problems or areas for improvement, and if there were any, they would fix them. But Olympic performed flawlessly. Her passengers loved her, her crew loved her. She was glorious. Her maiden voyage attracted considerable worldwide attention, just due to her size alone, and she was even open to the public, receiving over 8,000 visitors. 10,000 spectators watched her depart from New York Harbor for her return trip. Olympic was adored, but sadly, the fanfare and the joy wouldn't last. Just a few months after her maiden voyage, Olympic would suffer just a little bit of a whoopsie-daisy, just a kerfuffle, oh no, so sorry, involving a collision. Yeah, I should probably preface this whole thing with the fact that Olympic became pretty well known for running into stuff. Not actually sinking, but running into stuff. She did it more often than she should have, but, just one of those things, just RMS Olympic things, as it were. This first little uh-oh occurred on her 5th voyage, on September 20th, 1911, when she just kind of slammed into a British cruiser, HMS Hawk. At the time, the ships were running parallel to each other through the Solent, and when Olympic made a turn to starboard, the commander of Hawk was slightly alarmed to realize that the radius of Olympic's turn was not what he expected. He wasn't able to avoid a collision, and Hawk's bow, which actually had been designed specifically to sink ships by ramming into them, collided into Olympic's starboard side near her stern, tearing 2 large holes in her hull. This flooded 2 of her watertight compartments and twisted a propeller shaft right up. Olympic would settle slightly by the stern, but took the hit like a champ. She was able to return to Southampton under her own power, and no one was killed or seriously injured. Hawk, on the other hand, well, took pretty severe damage to her bow and nearly capsized, but she stayed afloat too. She'd later be repaired and served during World War I, though she would sadly be sunk by a German U-boat in October of 1914. At the time of the incident, Edward Smith was in command of the Olympic, and the subsequent inquiry by the Royal Navy blamed Olympic for the incident, alleging that her large displacement caused a suction within the ocean that pulled Hawk directly into her side. White Star couldn't really fight this. They tried to, but it was decided in the end that blame for the whole thing laid squarely with Olympic, even though Captain Smith wasn't blamed either, because technically, at that time, Olympic was under the control of the harbor pilot, not Captain Smith. Still, White Star was held directly liable, faced with very large legal bills, and, of course, the cost of fixing Olympic. She had stayed afloat, but she still was damaged, and that meant she couldn't even help pay for the situation because she couldn't serve in revenue service. She had 2 holes in her! She can't sail across the ocean like that. Actually, Olympic probably would have done it and been fine, but they weren't gonna try it, you know? Granted, in a way, it sort of helped Olympic, at least for a brief period of time, because it amplified the safety features that had been long touted on the Olympic classes. Olympic had been hit by a warship whose bow was designed to sink other ships, and stayed afloat. To the public eye, that was a good thing. And while the accident did cost White Star just way too much money, in time, in theory, they could easily make that money back, just due to the public perception of their vessel's safety. Before they could get to that, they'd have to fix Olympic. It took them 2 weeks to get Olympic in a state where she could safely sail to Belfast for permanent repairs. Those repairs would last about 6 weeks. And to expedite this process, Harden and Wolff decided to take one of Titanic's propeller shafts and stick them on Olympic, which delayed Titanic but did mean Olympic was fixed faster. She was back in service by November 20th, 1911, but on February 24th, 1912, one of her propeller blades just fell off. Just fell off. You know what? Olympic! Stop it! She once again had to go back to Harlan and Wolff for repairs, and once again they had to pull resources from finishing Titanic, which delayed her maiden voyage by a further 3 weeks. The Titanic would be finished, and carried out her own maiden voyage on April 10th, 1912. On the evening of April 14th, 1912, Olympic was also out at sea, performing a return trip from New York, under the command of Captain Herbert James Haddock. As she sailed along, without incident, her wireless operator, Ernest James Moore, received a sudden distress call from Olympic's sister, Titanic. The calls were urgent, and it was very clear to the crew on board the Olympic, as well as Captain Haddock, that Titanic was in serious distress. But Olympic was 505 miles away from Titanic. But Captain Haddock decided to try it anyway. They couldn't just ignore their fellow sailors' cries for help, nor would Olympic abandon her baby sister. Haddock ordered Olympic's engines to be set at full power, and she sailed, at full power, directly towards Titanic's location for 4 hours, stressing her power plant, traveling faster than she ever had before, or ever would again. she was able to get to roughly 100 nautical miles away from Titanic's position, though by that time they had lost contact with her. It was then they received a message from Captain Rostron, who was in command of Cunard's RMS Carpathia. The Carpathia had managed to arrive on the scene and fully realized the severity of what had took place that night. Rostron would tell Olympic that continuing on course to Titanic would do nothing. There wasn't anything they could do. All the boats were accounted for, they had managed to save 675 souls, and Titanic had foundered at roughly 2:20 a.m. Olympic did make the offer to take survivors to make it easier for Carpathia, but Rostron turned down this offer, under orders from Ismay, who had been on board Titanic and managed to survive. He was often viewed as a coward because he lived, but it is important to stress that Ismay actually did a lot of heroic things as Titanic sank, and only lived because of sheer dumb luck. He wound up next to a lifeboat that just happened to have room, and there was no one else nearby, so he seized his chance before she went under. He didn't run away like a coward as is often portrayed, though the sinking of Titanic would follow him until his dying day. Anyway, Ismay felt that if Olympic showed up, looking so similar to her sister, that she'd, kind of freak out the survivors. And Rostron kind of agreed with that, so Olympic was told to simply resume her scheduled voyage. Her mad dash to save her baby sister was impressive, but it had permanently damaged her power plant. She would never run quite the same way again, or ever really be the same again. The ghost of the Titanic would follow her for the rest of her service career, and in the end, she and her crew would have to accept that there was nothing they could have done. In the heavy amount of inquiries following the Titanic disaster, Olympic was a big part of it. While she wasn't identical to Titanic, they did have very similar design parameters, especially in overall build. The amount of lifeboats, the watertight doors, the bulkheads, and all the other safety equipment were pretty much the same. And she also carried out some sea tests to figure out the exact mechanics behind the ship's turning ability, to approximate how long it would have taken Titanic to turn after the iceberg was sighted. This information was pretty critical to trying to figure out exactly what happened with Titanic, but the big issue, more than anything else, was, hey guys, did we really think not putting enough lifeboats on board was a good idea? Well, that was quickly corrected, because obviously this idea was really stupid and bad, and no, you need those. So White Star immediately put a bunch of second-hand collapsible lifeboats on board to try to, offset that issue, but these were second-hand. They weren't really in great condition, and towards the end of April 1912, 284 of Olympic's firemen went on strike, because frankly they felt that these second-hand lifeboats weren't even seaworthy, that they were just thrown on there to save face and say, look, we have enough for everybody on board. We don't know if they float, but they're on board, and that's fine, right? Well, no, it wasn't fine. Not as far as the firemen were concerned. And by firemen, I don't mean firemen. I mean firemen. The guys who shovel the coal. And it's important to stress that when it came to Titanic, basically everyone in the engine room died. Like, all of them. Like, they didn't get out. So as far as they were concerned, they wanted enough actual proper lifeboats on board the stupid boat. Now. And the firemen really had a good point, because those collapsible lifeboats were visibly rotten and wouldn't even open. So they weren't very helpful. And by weren't very helpful, I mean they weren't helpful at all. They would not actually solve the issue. While this was all going on, White Star had been forced to hire 100 non-union crew members in order to keep things rolling. And on April 25th, the strikers would witness a test of 4 of those collapsible boats. One of them was unseaworthy. So yeah, based on this limited test, admittedly, 1/4 of the boats wouldn't work in the event of a catastrophic disaster. So they were like, you're gonna make sure all of them are gonna work. The strikers did say that if they could make all these boats seaworthy, they were willing to return to work. And that's completely fair, honestly. But there was a further issue with the fact that White Star had hired a bunch of non-union guys, and they wanted them to be fired so they could return to their jobs. White Star refused to do this, because the 100 guys they had hired were non-union and they preferred dealing with not the union. 54 sailors would then leave the ship entirely, objecting to the non-union crew, who they said weren't even qualified to do the jobs they were hired to do, and they refused to sail with them. Those 54 were then charged with mutiny and arrested. On May 4th, 1912, Portsmouth magistrates found the charges against those mutineers were proven, but decided to discharge them without imprisonment or fine because of the unique circumstance. These weren't guys that were just doing it on a whim or because they just didn't like their captain or something. It was because of a strike and a management issue, and they were like, okay, you did technically mutiny, but we're not gonna punish you for this because we also get it. And for White Star's part, it didn't help that they were dealing with a public relations nightmare. Titanic was, worldwide news. It was a complete disaster and stained their reputation, as well as Olympics. Their management feared that public opinion would be on the side of the strikers, and to be honest, yeah, probably. So they opted to let them return to work, and Olympic resumed her normal operations on May 15th. But over the summer, it was decided that she probably needed some changes, some, improvements, some, can we make sure she doesn't wind up like her sister? So on October 9th, 1912, Olympic was withdrawn from service, to be sent back to Harlem and Wolff for heavy modifications. These modifications pretty much all took into account what had happened on board Titanic, and were meant to drastically improve Olympic safety in the event of a disaster. For one thing, the number of lifeboats carried by her was increased from 20 to 68. An inner watertight skin was also constructed in the boiler and engine rooms, creating what was in effect a double hull. 5 of the watertight bulkheads were extended up to B deck, where originally they only rose up as far as E or D, which as it turned out was not actually high enough to keep the water from flooding over and consistently flooding over and sinking the ship. They also added an extra bulkhead to subdivide the electrical dynamo room, and her pumping apparatus was improved to better manage any flooding that might occur. And all these changes meant that if she was put in the exact same circumstances with the exact same kind of damage, Olympic would live. Her first 6 compartments could be breached, and she'd still remain afloat. When she returned to service in March of 1913, she would briefly regain the title of largest ocean liner in the world, which she had technically lost only briefly because of her sister, though when Titanic sank, then she got it again, and then she lost it again when Germany put the SS Imperator into service. Olympic was marketed as the new Olympic, highlighting her improved safety features so White Star could be like, yes, I know, we had a horrible, horrible disaster, but we have addressed all those issues. I promise you, Olympic won't get you killed. And to be fair, Olympic wouldn't get you killed. Olympic was very safe, and she continued to be safe, sailing in relative peace and calm after the plague of chaos that had happened after the sinking of Titanic. The only major thing that happened during this time was she got caught in a storm, which she rode out quite well. She did great, but the storm broke some of her first-class windows and injured a few passengers. But she didn't sink, so, hey, that's a win. Kinda, except the broken glass, but it'll be fine. Additionally, Olympic and her crew knew that they wouldn't be sailing alone for much longer. As, remember, there were supposed to be 3 Olympic-class liners, and White Star intended to finish the 3rd. RMS Britannic, who'd been laid down November 30th, 1911, though she wasn't launched until February 26, 1914. Finally finished December 12th, 1915. However, Olympic, once again, wouldn't get to know her baby sister for very long, but for somewhat different reasons. Britannic would never actually enter service as an ocean liner. Instead, she was requisitioned by the Royal Navy due to the onset of World War I. They needed more ships, particularly a hospital ship, which is exactly what Britannic became. Instead of a fancy ocean liner, she became a floating hospital, dubbed HMHS Britannic. An Olympic would eventually be requisitioned too, though not immediately. See, when World War I first broke out, it wasn't realized how long it would drag on for, so the Royal Navy didn't take her out of passenger service immediately, neither did White Star. She remained in commercial service, still under Captain Haddock, though she was repainted to a gray color scheme, and her portholes were blocked with the lights on her deck turned off. This was to make her less visible, and therefore less likely to be shot at. Her schedule also was changed slightly. Instead, her last stop on the return trip would be Liverpool, not Southampton, and that would eventually be altered to Glasgow instead of Liverpool. Most of her voyages around this time, particularly the ones going to America, were filled with Americans, who were in Europe for whatever reason, and when everyone started killing each other, they were like, wow, can we go home? And Olympic took them home. The eastbound journeys in particular had very few passengers, because, who the heck's going on vacation in Europe right now? No one's going on vacation in Europe right now. Everything's exploding. And eventually, even Americans going back home, or refugee numbers, started to dwindle. Bookings had fallen sharply, because people were starting to get scared of German U-boats, who were in the habit of just shooting at whatever the heck they wanted, regardless of whether it was a warship or not. White Star, in an effort to both protect Olympic as well as save their bottom line since she wasn't generating money anymore, withdrew her from commercial service. Her last commercial voyage during the war took place on October 21st, 1914, when she left New York for Glasgow, with only 153 passengers on board. Basically, no one. But that did mean she had a lot of extra room, which was good because of what happened on the trip back. On the 6th day of that particular voyage, October 27th, Olympic was traveling off the north coast of Ireland. She was nearly home, but she received distress calls from the battleship HMS Audacious. Man, the Royal Navy is good at these names. Audacious! However, Audacious had been a little too audacious, and wound up striking a mine off of Tory Island, and was taking on a lot of water, an alarming amount of water, we're actually kind of sinking amount of water. Olympic decided to help, taking 250 of Audacious's crew, and the plan was actually to save Audacious as well. The destroyer, HMS Fury, attached a tow line between Audacious and Olympic. Olympic was powerful enough to pull even a whole battleship and get her to a place where she could at least be beached. The cable broke when Audacious's steering gear failed, and when they tried it again, the cable got tangled in HMS Liverpool's propellers, severing it. They tried a third time, and again the cable did not work. By 1700, Audacious's quarterdeck was awash, and it was decided that, okay, we obviously can't do this, let's get everyone left on Audacious off of her. The crew evacuated, some going to Olympic and some going to Liverpool. At 20:55, an explosion occurred aboard Audacious, and she finally sank. Though she was the savior of several sailors, the situation kind of put Olympic in a little bit of an awkward position. Just a little teensy bit of a, oh no. Because Admiral Sir John Jellicoe, who was the commander of the home fleet, didn't want news of Audacious's sinking getting out. He felt that it would be demoralizing to the British public, and because Olympic was staffed with civilians and had a handful of civilians on board who would definitely blab about this, Olympic was instead held in custody. No communications were permitted at all, and the passengers weren't allowed to leave Olympic. The only people that were allowed to step off were the crew of Audacious and the chief surgeon who was transferring to RMS Celtic. One of the passengers on Olympic was Charles M. Schwab, who was a wealthy steel tycoon, and he sent word to Sir John Jellicoe that, hey, I am a businessman, I got stuff to do, and some of that stuff I'm doing involves steel. Most of it, actually. And the steel is something you need for the war. Okay? Like, to build warships. Jellicoe realized that, yeah, actually, that's a good point. So he let Schwab go on the condition that he promised to say nothing about Audacious. Eventually, everyone was allowed to leave, including Olympic. They were released on November 2nd, with Olympic being permitted to sail to Belfast, where her passengers finally were able to step on shore. White Star intended to let her stay in Belfast until the war was over, but when the war continued dragging on, the Admiralty decided that in addition to Britannic being used as a hospital ship, Olympic was also going to be taken as a troop ship. She wasn't the only ocean liner to get this treatment. Cunard's Mauretania and Aquitania also wound up in this position. And the Admiralty had only waited to do this because, frankly, they didn't want to use ocean liners as troop ships at all. Their large size and not at all being designed for military purposes meant they were pretty vulnerable to attacks, particularly by U-boats. But because the war kept going and they couldn't replace their lost ships fast enough, they really didn't have an option. They needed more troop ships, so Olympic was going to do it. Olympic was stripped of her peacetime fittings and armed with a handful of guns, 12-pounders and 4.7-inch guns. She could carry up to 6,000 troops and was given the temporary name of HMT 2810. So, not really a fancy name at all. Everyone just still called her Olympic. Shh, don't tell anybody. And she was then under the command of Bertram Fox Hayes. She would leave Liverpool carrying 6,000 soldiers to Madras. On October 1st, 1915, she would again play hero, rescuing 34 survivors from lifeboats from the French ship Provincia, which had been sunk by a German U-boat. Despite this, Hayes was heavily criticized by the British Admiralty, who accused him of putting the ship in harm's way by stopping in waters where they knew enemy U-boats were. Even though it was the morally right thing to do, because why, you wanted to leave the 34 people to die? That's what you wanted us to do. Okay, we don't do that here. And the French actually had a much different opinion regarding this situation because it was their people that Olympic had saved. French Vice Admiral Louis d'Artigue du Fournay wound up awarding Captain Hayes the Gold Medal of Honor, the Honor Medal for Courage and Devotion, a French decoration. Olympic would make several more journeys to the Mediterranean until early 1916, but those eventually ceased when the Gallipoli campaign was abandoned entirely. After that, it was thought maybe she could take troops to India via the Cape of Good Hope, but the problem was the distance here. Olympic had been designed to go across the Atlantic, not, around the world, and her coal bunkers just weren't large enough for her to run at a reasonable speed the whole way. Instead, she was chartered by the Canadian government between 1916 and 1917 to transport troops from Halifax, Nova Scotia, over to Britain for the war. Sadly, it was during this time that she would lose her last remaining sister, Britannic. Britannic would strike a mine in the Aegean Sea on November 21st, 1916, and sink. Olympic, going back and forth between Britain and Canada, was nowhere near her, and once again could have done nothing to save her only remaining family. Olympic was therefore truly alone. Still, though, she herself was loved by many, particularly those in Canada. Her size was impressive, she was a great sight, and she was in her dazzle camouflage. With all the crazy lines and wackadoodle shapes, she stood out, with artist Arthur Lismer painting portraits of her, and there was even a large dance hall called the Olympic Gardens, named after her. Then, when America finally entered the conflict, very late to the party, Olympic was used to transport American troops across the pond, because y'all couldn't learn to behave over here. Why did you have to do this? Germany! Why did you ask Mexico to invade us? Why did you sink the Lusitania? These were things that you did, and they were wrong, and we're gonna show you how wrong you were. But as for Olympic, well, it is understandable that at this point in her life, she is probably a little annoyed, angry, just irritated, because, both her baby sisters are dead. She's been stuck in this war for several years, having to go back and forth, not taking happy people on majestic voyages. No, she's fighting a stupid conflict, and she was hungry for blood. On May 12th, 1918, in the early hours of the morning, Olympic was on her way to France, in the middle of the English Channel, with more American troops, under the command of Captain Hayes again. During this time, she would sight a U-boat on the surface, just 500 meters ahead. Olympic would fire on the sub, and Captain Hayes decided, actually, instead of that, how about we just ram her?
Perhaps today is a good day to die. Prepare for ramming speed!
Olympic was turned to ram the submarine. just because both Titanic and Britannic died from ramming into stuff doesn't mean Olympic is going to. Because Olympic doesn't go out that way. She already hit a warship once and lived, and she'll do it again. The U-boat did crash dive to 30 meters and turned on a parallel course to avoid getting run over, but she wasn't deep enough. Olympic hit the sub just aft of her conning tower, and her port propeller sliced through the U-boat's pressure hull. U-103 did miraculously manage to blow tanks fast enough to get to the surface, scuttle the boat, and abandon ship. The Olympic did not stop to pick up any survivors, cause screw them, I guess. They just kept on going. Instead, USS Davis, a Sampson-class destroyer under the American Navy, sighted a distress flare from the Germans, and she would pick up 31 survivors. After dropping off her troops in France, Olympic would return to Southampton, and it would be found that 2 of her hull plates were dented, and her prow was twisted to one side, but not actually breached. So, she was fine. Interviews with the survivors of U-103 would show that the sub had been preparing to fire on Olympic with a torpedo, but they didn't get the stern torpedo tubes flooded quick enough. When they realized that Olympic was not playing, they attempted their crash dive, but, well, obviously that didn't work too well. Captain Hayes was not criticized for his decision. In fact, he was awarded with the DSO, or the Distinguished Service Order, and a few of the American soldiers on board Olympic during the event paid for a plaque to be placed in one of her lounges to commemorate it, because frankly, it was just metal as all heck. And it was during the war that she got her nickname, Old Reliable. In total, she carried up to 201,000 troops and other personnel, burned 347,000 tons of coal, and traveled 184,000 miles. Captain Hayes was knighted in 1919, and Olympic would henceforth be distinctive as being the only passenger liner to ram and sink a German U-boat during the First World War. She ain't playing! Both her sisters died horribly. You think she's gonna go out that way? She ain't. In August of 1919, Olympic would finally return to Belfast to be returned to her civilian service. Her wartime service was finally over, and she could go back to doing what she was meant to do. Her interiors were all modernized, and she was converted from coal firing to oil firing. That was an economical decision, not because oil was that much cheaper than coal, it really wasn't, but the refueling time was a lot different. It took days to completely refuel Olympic when she used coal, but now that she was using oil, she could be completely refueled in 5 to 6 hours, not days. So yeah, it was a good decision. It also allowed for much steadier engine RPM, and meant that they could reduce engine room personnel from the 350 that Olympic had to just 60. And it was during her work that it was discovered she had some damage that no one knew about. There was a dent with a crack at the center, below her waterline. Odd. After some investigation and analysis, it was determined that this had been a torpedo. She had been torpedoed! However, given the fact Olympic was still alive, it was believed that this torpedo had simply failed to detonate. Or perhaps the torpedo refused to detonate in fear of being rammed by Olympic. At the time, it was not known exactly which U-boat had fired this, though in the modern day, some suspect it was probably SMU-53, which would have fired on her on September 4th, 1918 in the English Channel. Regardless, the torpedo again did not explode, so Olympic was like, you really want to do this?
So what are you doing here?
Oh, just flying around.
Flying around?
Flying around.
Thwarting my plans?
What are your plans?
Are you?
No.
Good, because that'd be bad.
How bad?
I'd have to kill you.
That's bad.
Indeed.
Olympic would emerge from her refit with an increased tonnage, which meant that she could retain her claim to the title of largest British-built liner afloat. However, she was no longer the largest liner in general on the ocean, but still Olympic was beloved, as the last survivor of her class, a war hero, and just being a beautiful ship to be on. She would return to passenger service on June 25th, 1920, with one voyage in particular carrying 2,249 passengers. She carried 28,000 people in total throughout the second half of 1920, and transported a record 38,000 in 1921, which was the peak of her entire career. With World War I over, people were eager to travel, so Olympic was in high demand. The White Star did have a bit of an issue in terms of utilizing her because, well, she was supposed to have two other sisters. They were meant to be her running mates for express service, but Olympic didn't have her sisters, she was alone. So instead, in 1922, White Star wound up getting a hold of two German liners. Majestic, originally named SS Bismarck. No, not that Bismarck, this Bismarck. And Amharic, originally named Columbus. They were given to Britain as war reparations, and these two would work with Olympic as her running mates. Not quite replacements for her lost family, but perfectly serviceable vessels, and the trio would run well together over the next few years. Throughout the 20s in particular, Olympic was in arguably her golden age. She was finally able to do what she was meant to do, and she was considered popular and very fashionable. Many rich and successful people specifically got tickets aboard Olympic, and part of her appeal was honestly because of Titanic in a way. Since she was nearly identical to her, people wanted to experience being on a ship like Titanic. And regardless, she still sailed proudly, though again, not without incident. On March 22nd, 1924, Olympic managed to hit another ship. Why are you like this? This time it happened in New York Harbor, as she was reversing out of her berth. Her stern hit a smaller liner, Fort St. George. This caused heavy damage to Fort St. George, and at first it was thought Olympic again took it like a champ, though later it was revealed that her stern post had been fractured, so the entire stern frame had to be replaced, but again she kept sailing. Though it was also during the 1920s, there was a slight bit of a hiccup to Olympic's operations. Many people she was taking across the Atlantic were immigrants, traveling from Europe to America. But changes in the immigration law in the US during the 1920s restricted the number of immigrants that were allowed to enter the country per year to about 160,000 starting in 1924. That meant that there were just less immigrants getting tickets across the Atlantic because, well, they couldn't enter the country. This meant that Olympic was slightly retooled. Between 1927 and 28, she was converted for tourist runs, which were called third cabin passengers, as well as her usual first, second, and third classes. Tourist third cabin was meant to attract travelers who desired comfort, but without paying a lot for it. Kind of like the early concept of a cruise ship, although, again, Olympic wasn't a cruise ship. For a few years, tourist third cabin was its own thing, though eventually it was decided to simply merge tourist third cabin with second class, simply called tourist, in late 1931, with first and third remaining much the same. In 1932, Olympic had her first class cabins improved by adding more bathrooms and a dance floor, and she had a bit of a spooky incident in November of 1929. On the 18th, she was traveling westbound, quite close to where her sister Titanic had died, when she started shaking. A lot, just violently shaking. These vibrations continued for 2 minutes. Now, there was a logical explanation for this. It had been caused by the 1929 Grand Banks earthquake. So yeah, no spirit stuff going on here, no supernatural nonsense. There was a completely reasonable explanation for this. Also, it's really freaking weird that it happened where it did, okay? I don't know. I don't like that. However, into the 30s, things were becoming quite difficult. It was the Great Depression, and people had less money, and therefore there was less people traveling. During the 20s, there had been around 1 million passengers a year on the entirety of the transatlantic route, which was great. But by 1934, that had dropped to just half. There was also increased competition. Germany had managed to scrape themselves back into the transatlantic role, and both Italy and France also offered their own transatlantic ocean liners. The passengers that were left taking the transatlantic routes, able to afford it, preferred the more modern ships, which had newer accommodation, newer styles, And Olympic, well, she had been updated, she still was 20 years old. Up until that point, she had averaged roughly 1,000 passengers per journey, but that was halved by 1932. One of Olympic's running mates at that point, Amharic, was withdrawn that same year. with only Olympic and Majestic maintaining White Star Line's Southampton to New York service. To help offset things, Olympic and Majestic occasionally did summer recreational cruises from New York to Pier 21 in Halifax, Nova Scotia, but that was only a band-aid in an overall problem. White Star did what they could to manage things, but it was the Great Depression. There was only so much they could do. They could offer the best service around with the best ship, with the most luxury, but you had to have customers that can afford it. And customers couldn't afford anything at the time. Olympic was refitted again in 1932. This time the process took 4 months, and she'd returned to service on March 5th, 1933, in incredibly good condition, but that didn't help fix the problem. She still needed passengers, meaning that in 1933 and 1934, Olympic would run at an operating loss for the first time in her life, but she still pushed forward for just a little bit longer. However, not without at least one more incident. In 1934, she hit another ship. Why are you the way that you are? I don't know if she was just trying to prove that she could keep hitting stuff and not sink on principle because of her sisters, but it happened again. This time it was a light ship, which is a ship, but it acts as a lighthouse. It's used in waters that are too deep or otherwise unsuitable for actually having a lighthouse, and they help guide ships into harbor, in this case towards New York. Olympic, like plenty of other ships, had been known to pass close by those vessels, but that was alright, because they weren't hitting them. However, on May 15th, there was incredibly bad fog, and to help navigate, she was homing in on the radio beacon of Nantucket lightship LV-117. Olympic was under the command of Captain John W. Binks, and it was realized a little bit too late, again due to the fog, that actually Olympic was barreling directly down on LV-117. They weren't able to turn out of the way. It was just impossible. They had no room, and she ran directly into the lightship. 4 of the lightship's crew went down with her, and 7 were rescued by Olympic, though 3 would later die of their injuries. The dependents of those killed in this accident were given restitution through the United States Employees Compensation Act. Olympic would take, again, relatively minor damage, and no one really blamed her or her crew because it had been an accident. It was heavy fog. And she did stop to save who she could, so bad luck, again, but Olympic pressed on, though not for much longer. Also in 1934, due to the Depression, both struggling, the White Star Line and Cunard, their historical competitor, would merge together as a result of consistent prodding from the British government to form Cunard White Star. The merger did allow funds to be granted for the completion of 2 new ships, the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. When they were done, these 2 modern vessels could handle Cunard White Star's express services, meaning that the older liners were rendered redundant. Olympic would be withdrawn from transatlantic service, leaving New York for the very last time on April 5th, 1935. She returned to Britain and was laid up in Southampton. Cunard White Star didn't necessarily want to scrap Olympic immediately. They thought that perhaps they could continue using her for summer cruises, for a short time at least. But this was uneconomical, so instead she was put up for sale. There were many potential buyers, and among them was actually a syndicate that wanted to turn her into a floating hotel off the south coast of France, which is one of the very few ways ocean liners have historically been preserved. But unfortunately, that just didn't happen. Olympic was laid up for 5 months alongside Mauritania, and was eventually sold to Sir John Jarvis, who was a member of Parliament at the time, for £97,500. His intention was to partially demolish her at Jarrow to provide necessary work for people who needed it. On October 11, 1935, Olympic left Southampton for the final time, arriving in Jarrow 2 days later. Her scrapping began after her fittings were auctioned off, and between 1935 and 1937, Olympic was slowly but surely taken apart. On September 19th of 1937, what remained of her was towed to Thos W. Ward's yard at Inverkeithing to be completely destroyed. a process that was completed by early 1939. She was removed from the shipping registry on February 4th of that year. Many would mourn her loss, with her chief engineer remarking, "I could understand the necessity if the old lady had lost her efficiency, but the engines are as sound as they ever were." And with Olympic's death, it rendered her grand class, the Olympic class, completely extinct. To date, she's one of the most mourned of the ocean liners. It is, as I've mentioned many times previously, violently expensive to preserve any kind of large ship. It just is. They're money pits. They need constant attention to stay afloat. The ocean eats them, and they're big. You can only put them so many places, but let's be real here. If there was one singular ocean liner in history that deserved and should have been preserved somehow, it was Olympic. Not just because of herself and her sterling career, that on its own is worthy of praise and acknowledgement, but she's Titanic's sister. Titanic is arguably the most famous ship in history due to what happened to her. And if Olympic was allowed to stay around, allowed to be preserved, she could easily be one of the most sought-after museum destinations on the planet. She could be a huge, massive educational piece for both her own history and both of her sisters' history. The Olympic class is one of the most well-known classes of ocean liners ever. It would be awesome. But sadly, time is a cruel mistress, and history cannot be undone. What has occurred has occurred. And Olympic is long gone, though many artifacts from her remain. The old lady will likely always be remembered.